Hello. Well, it's extremely nice to be back in this building. I haven't been here for quite a while since I've moved away. And so it's actually really, really lovely to be back in, especially on a glorious day like this. Today, we started to hear the very beginning of the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And we heard a little bit about how Jesus was doing something else. So he was looking for a quiet place to be. He was looking for a quiet place to pray. And he was interrupted. And he was interrupted by crowds. And his immediate response was to talk to those crowds, to talk to those people, to heal them, to help them, and in fact later in that particular story to feed them and to make sure that they were well in themselves. And that kind of is a thing that struck me about that story. And you see, as Jesus later moves through the towns and through the villages, he's on his way somewhere and people interrupt him again by bringing the sick out for him to look at and to heal and to help. And to me, it's a critical characteristic of Jesus that he's interrupted, that things are going wrong in people's lives, but he jumps in and helps. He doesn't ignore it. He makes sure he helps the least fortunate people around him. And I wanted to talk about the idea today of Jesus meeting us where we are and meeting us when we are needy. But I was kind of overtaken by some recent events in the news that kind of spoke to me about this story as well. So we learned this week that for ourselves as a country here in the UK, we're going to have a £4 billion cut to our foreign aid budget. And there was such a striking comparison to me between the approach of Jesus and the approach that our country takes. When people come to Jesus, he meets their needs. He helps them. And you notice in that story there that there was no question from Jesus about what's your nationality? Where'd you come from? What's your skin color? We don't hear Jesus asking these questions to people when he reaches out to help them. We don't hear any account at all of people reaching out for Jesus' cloak and him saying, sorry, let me help my own people first. It's not something that we can hear happening in that story. He just meets their needs and helps them where they are. That's the version of Jesus that we heard from in the reading today. This week in the House of Commons, the government announced that £4 billion cut to foreign aid. Whilst that cut was announced, and I was watching a little bit of it later on, whilst that cut was announced, you could hear cheering going on in the background from the government benches to signal the happiness that people had about a £4 billion cut to the poorest people all around the world. That's going to mean a 60% cut to the UN Children's Fund that we pay into. The International Rescue Committee, just total side note for a second, I had to reread International Rescue Committee like about 4 times or something, because anyone ever remember Thunderbirds at all? Kind of reminded me of that. Is that not Thunderbirds? Never mind. A different generation there for me from some of you younger folks. So the International Rescue Fund, though, says that 11,000 girls in rural Pakistan now won't get an education as a result of those cuts. The Polio Eradication Fund will lose almost all of its funding from the UK, and 8 organisations which help give food and shelter to refugees in Bangladesh will lose about half their funding. Many would say that after the pandemic and the pandemic that we're still in, Perhaps we need to prioritize where we spend our money. We've spent a lot, and so we have to prioritize. And maybe that's right. Maybe we do have to prioritize. But it's also worthwhile noting that as a country, that £4 billion that we've cut will cause incredible harm and suffering, and it compares a bit unfavourably to the $42 billion that we spend on defence every year. The $5 billion of that is an upkeep of buildings that we pay out for. It's an interesting thing that we would happily pay for the upkeep of buildings and maintenance for defence buildings, but not pay money to the poorest in the world. Perhaps we think that these actions of government have very little relevance to us and our lives as Christians, and that the following of Jesus doesn't mean anything about following what's happening in the world. But it's also worthwhile noting that amongst our leaders, many of our leaders profess a devout Christian faith. Michael Gove, Boris Johnson, all profess that they have a devout Christian faith, that they believe in Jesus, that they believe in God. And it makes me wonder how you could read the Gospels, feel your life changed by the living Jesus, and then conclude at the end of it that in your immensely powerful job, what you should do is cut down on the help that we give to refugees, the poor and the needy around the world. It's near to inconceivable for me to imagine that you could read the life of Jesus and think that one of the messages is, leave everyone to their own devices. Don't help people if they don't live within your own borders. I think only by creating your own version of Jesus could you do that. Only by creating a Jesus that matches your own thoughts and feelings could you do that. And it's really important that we reject that version of Jesus that people sometimes peddle. When you look at some of the right-wing Christian media in America, you hear the idea that Jesus blesses those people that follow him with money and with wealth, and that a sign of whether Jesus loves you is whether you're in a big house with a big car. And that's genuine preaching from people who talk about themselves as being Christians. Only by creating your own version of Jesus could that be possible. One of my favorite pastors, a guy called Carlos Rodriguez, talks about different versions of Jesus that people create in their mind. And he says this: I reject the version of Jesus who would have told the rich young leader, you are blessed, instead of give everything you have to the poor and follow me. I reject the version of Jesus who would have pushed women to the side of the story instead of making Mary the first preacher of the resurrection. I reject the version of Jesus that would have taken up residence in a big home in Jerusalem and become a famous person of wealth instead of walking among the hurting and those nobody would visit. I reject that version of Jesus that would have used the sword to rule rather than help those and heal those who experience hurt because of violence. I reject this version of Jesus as a fabrication of racism, misogyny, and a golden calf of greed. Instead, I follow the Christ who preaches good news to the poor, feeds the hungry, empowers the marginalized, and loves the broken parts of you and me. But maybe the likes of Michael Gove and the likes of Boris Johnson aren't the only ones that can close their eyes to the suffering around us in the world. I know I do, far too often. We kind of forget, and I'm very guilty of that myself. I was thinking that actually only this morning, knowing what I was going to preach on. I was moaning about some stuff around houses, and it reminded me actually of what I was going to talk about today. I knew what I was going to talk about, and still I had this moan about what we would call a first world problem. We forget how incredibly rich and affluent we are. That money that we cut from the third world and from refugees would make a huge difference. And we forget that we actually live in a place of great wealth and great prosperity. There's a book that I read some time ago, and it's called The Ones Who Walked Away from Omelas. The book centres around this sort of fictional place called Omelas. Everything's kind of really quite perfect there. There's not much suffering, and it's a society where people have got enough food to eat, and they've got shelter if they need it, for the most part, and people are treated when they're ill. And everyone's pretty happy growing up in this place called Omelas, but there's a catch. When you reach a certain age, you're told about the catch of living in Omelas. To keep this standard of living, there's only one thing that can be done. A small single child must be kept in suffering. The child must be kept afraid and alone in perpetual filth and misery, and no one can help the child. And that's the condition of living on Omelas. You have to accept to have this wonderful life that somewhere else there's a little child that's suffering. And after their initial disgust about this, most people live with this idea, and they forget about the child and they get on with their lives. But some don't, and those are the ones that, as the title of the book says, walk away from Omelas. We live in Omelas. It's hard to imagine Jesus, who in our story today is looking for a place to rest and instead heals and feeds the people that he comes across. It's hard to imagine him putting up with a system where some people are kept in perpetual filth, darkness, and misery. You only have to think about that for a moment or two to realize that that's not what Jesus would accept. And we're called to be followers of Jesus. And that means challenging who we are and the kind of things that we do. As we start to reimagine what church is going to look like, we have to think of the most needy and the most vulnerable in society. I've got a short story to share from myself about how we need to think about ourselves and what we do as we reimagine what we're going to be looking like as we reopen to the world, hopefully at some point reasonably soon. A month or two ago, I was out on Argyle Street, and I was sitting to a guy that I know pretty well who's sitting and begging on Argyle Street. And we were chatting about how people often take photos of him whilst they're giving him money. So it's a relatively new thing he was telling me about. People will give him money, but they'll take a little photo of themselves, a selfie, if you want to use the young word, whilst they give him money, or they'll video themselves whilst they give him a bag of food. And this is a relatively common thing now. People will do that, and then they'll put it on social media, and they'll show how wonderful they are. And we were sort of chatting about that, and he was saying to me something which was really sort of bigged me up for a moment or two. He was saying, he knows that I work for a Christian organisation, and he said, you Christians are a bit different, you don't do that. And I felt quite an unwarranted degree of smugness about that. us Christians are different. We act in different ways. So I felt a bit smug, and I felt a bit self-satisfied about that as an idea. We're different. We don't act like that. And he started talking to me about his faith and how he had looked for belonging in various places and hadn't found it. And he said that he had found a faith in God. He absolutely believed in God. He absolutely believed in Jesus. And it brought him great comfort during the horrible life that he's got for himself. And as part of this chat, I kind of asked him, okay, cool, did you go to a church at all? And he said, no, I couldn't. That's too middle class. I wouldn't fit in. And I've very rarely turned from loads of smugness to a great deal of shame. And I did feel a great deal of shame in that. And I think about that sentence quite often as we think about what church is going to be and how we act like Jesus. I couldn't. It's too middle class. I wouldn't fit in. Jesus told us when he had that jar of perfume poured over his feet that the poor will always be with us. And that's something that kind of always bothered me. And it seems at first glance that Jesus seems to be making a sort of a throwaway comment, that he's saying, there's always going to be poor folk. Don't worry about it. Let's just deal with this just now. There's always going to be poor folks about. That's just going to happen. But I kind of think now that he knows our nature better than we think. That he knows because of our own comfort that we can sometimes have. And I speak completely of myself here. The comfort that we have and the way that we get used to comfort and well-being, that we can just sort of turn a blind eye to the suffering in the world. Thinking back to that story today, even though Jesus had things to do, and even though Jesus was on a different route and going to different places, he always stopped. He always allowed people to be healed. He always fed. And maybe as we reimagine what we're going to be looking like, that's a lesson for us to all take in. I'd like to finish with a final thought on this, though. It's a thing that's different about Jesus. Because when I was thinking about all this, I actually depressed myself a wee bit, to be quite honest. And the thing that's different about Jesus is that his love is not conditional. Even for folks like Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, who, if I was being honest, I would happily trip up if I saw them walking down a flight of stairs. Even for folks like that, his love is not conditional. We often fail and we often do the wrong thing. I know I do on a daily basis when we try and follow the ways of Jesus. But the love that we are given is not conditional on our approach to the problems of the world. Even when we do things wrong, even when there's great suffering around us and we just feel completely lost, God still absolutely loves us. And there's nothing we can do that would make God love us less. There's no failures to act we can have that would make God love us less. We're called to do these things. These things can be difficult or impossible sometimes, seemingly. But God loves us regardless of whether we fail or succeed. There's always going to be a light that shines in the darkness from God. And there's never going to be anything that we can do to fight that light. There's nothing we can do to stop it coming through. I've been watching a show recently called The Chosen. It's a good one. You have to download an app. And it's about the disciples of Jesus and the followers of them through their own eyes. And the version of Jesus in that show says something that I think resonates with the real version of Jesus. That version of Jesus says, in this world, bones will still break, hearts will still break, but in the end, the light will overcome the darkness. And that promise always holds true. Thanks be to God.